Remember when Japanese companies used to make the coolest stuff in the world? From the 80s, you had the Walkman that made everyone want to walk around with headphones. Japan brought us Super Mario from Nintendo, arguably the most recognizable video game character on the planet. Then we got the PlayStation that saved video gaming, and the Toyota Prius that made hybrids cool. But here is something I've been curious about. Why doesn't there seem to be a single globally dominant company coming out of Japan since the 90s? Like, can you even name one that's globally relevant right now, other than a few automotive companies like Toyota and Honda that are themselves from earlier decades? In 1988, 32 of the world's top 50 companies were Japanese. As of 2025, only Toyota makes the list. So how did Japan go from dominating the world to being completely invisible in the global tech race? And more importantly, can they actually make a comeback, or has that ship sailed forever? Let me present to you what we've researched, and at the end of the video, you tell me. Does Japan have what it takes to build the next world-changing company? To understand why Japan seems unable to produce new Sonys today, we need to better understand exactly how they were able to build all these OG global giants in the first place. Because think about it, back in the 80s and 90s, they didn't have the internet or smartphones, right? There were no app store or even social media platforms to advertise and sell your products globally. Back then, the Japanese probably didn't even speak English as well as they can now. So what was the secret sauce, and can that be replicated today? Picture this, it's 1946. Japan has just lost World War II in the most devastating way possible. Over 3 million Japanese dead and their military completely destroyed. But the real devastation was economic. Japan had poured everything, and I mean everything, into the war effort. They had converted entire industries to build planes, ships, and weapons instead of consumer goods. So when they surrendered in August 1945, it all came crashing down at once. No military orders meant no work. No work meant no money. Also, bear in mind that Japan is an island nation that had always imported food and raw materials. But now, no one would trade with them. They were literally cut off from the world. So by 1946, Japan's economy had shrunk to just 53% of its pre-war size. People are eating sweet potato leaves and tree barks to survive. Tokyo's population dropped from 4.5 million to 2.5 million as people fled to the countryside searching for food. But here's what's incredible. This moment of total devastation became Japan's secret weapon. The Japanese government made a radical decision. Instead of spending on the military like before, they would pour everything into conquering the world through exports. They kept half of their old imperial slogan, Fukoku Kyohei, which meant rich country, strong army, and flipped the concept into rich country and strong companies. Entered the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MITI, which was renamed in 2001 as the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. During Japan's economic miracle, MITI operated like a startup accelerator for entire industries. It strategically backed the sectors most likely to win: steel, shipbuilding, electronics, and automobiles, focusing support on the most promising companies in each field. Then they protected these companies from foreign competition while pumping them with cheap loans. Here's the clever part. Instead of using tax money directly, they created an alternative financing system called Physical Investment and Loan Program that funneled Japanese citizens' savings deposits and pension funds into loans for their chosen companies. So when regular people put money into post office savings account, the money would end up financing Sony and Toyota at below market interest rates. They also systematically imported the world's best technology while keeping foreign companies out, allowing licensing deals but blocking foreign investment so Japanese firms got the knowledge without the competition. And if you got rejected for a loan from the Development Bank of Japan, they would literally coach you through multiple applications until you succeeded, working with you to refine your business plan and strategy. The results? By the 1980s, Japanese companies were filing more patent applications than the US. So you can see that there was this huge push by the Japanese government to create global companies. But it wasn't just policy that gave rise to Sony. It also required visionary founders who thought of going global from day one. Take Akio Morita, Sony's co-founder. Born in 1921 in Nagoya, he was the eldest son and 15th generation heir to one of Japan's oldest sake brewing families, a business that had been running since 1665. But Morita became obsessed with electronics, building his own ham radio and nearly flunking out of school because he ignored everything except tinkering with gadgets. During World War II, he served as a lieutenant in the Japanese Navy, working on thermal guidance weapons and night vision gun sights, where he met his future business partner Masaru Ibuka, an electronics engineer 13 years his senior. After the war, he was offered a prestigious teaching position at Tokyo Institute of Technology, but he and his business partner decided to abandon their safe, traditional paths to building something completely new together. Sony's early years were built on bold risks and personal sacrifices. The company's first consumer product was an electric rice cooker in 1945, a complete failure that either burned rice or left it undercooked. But Morita did not give up. In 1950, they launched Japan's first tape recorder, though it also sold poorly initially. The breakthrough came with transistor radios. In 1955, Sony released the TR-55, Japan's first commercially produced transistor radio. A major US watch company, Bulova, offered to buy 100,000 TR-55 units at the time, a deal worth more than Sony's entire market capitalization at the time. There was just one catch. Sony would have to remove its unknown brand name and replace it with Bulova's. The Tokyo management team urged Morita to take the deal, but he refused, famously declaring, "In 50 years' time, we'll have made the name Sony as famous as yours. So it's a no, thank you." With Sony's reputation growing, Morita set his sights on the United States. Though he had studied some English in school, he was apparently self-conscious about his accent and limited vocabulary that on his first New York trip, he kept to modest routines, eating at automats and avoiding high-profile interactions. Then his American advisor, Masaru Kagawa, pulled him aside and said, "Look, if you want to be taken seriously, stay in the cheapest room of the best hotel, not the best room of the cheapest hotel." Morita took the advice and moved into the Windsor Arms Hotel, and instantly, US partners began treating him like a serious executive. By projecting confidence through his surroundings, he unlocked better conversations, more English practice, and crucial distribution deals.
So the implication is you must hire very carefully.
Yes, very carefully. So, under such a circumstances, to run business organization is very difficult.
That shift in perception was crucial at the 1960 Institute of Radio Engineers National Convention, where Morita signed Sony's first major US distribution deal, walking the booth floor in a bespoke suit and convincing American dealers that Sony was a brand to watch. Later that year, Sony opened its first US office in New York, becoming the first Japanese electronics company with a major American presence. Fast forward to 1979, Morita bet on a product that nobody believed in, the Walkman. Investing heavily in design, marketing tie-ins with young musicians, and street teams of college students in Tokyo, Morita launched the portable music player. By 1983, Sony had sold over 50 million Walkmans worldwide, and Walkman was added to the Oxford English Dictionary. Proof that Morita's global vision and personal risk-taking paid off in a way no government policy ever could. But what powered Japan's post-war miracle wasn't just government policy or individual geniuses. It was a radical new social contract that forged an army of dedicated employees willing to sacrifice everything for their companies. Japan may be the oldest society in the world today, but back in the 80s, it had one of the youngest and hungriest workforces on the planet. Enter the salaryman system, the cultural phenomenon behind the now iconic image of the impeccably dressed office worker, suit neatly pressed, briefcase in hand, boarding a jam-packed commuter train at dawn, and belting out karaoke tunes well past midnight. Imagine joining Sony at the age of 22 and knowing you would stay there for life. Your career path, benefits, even housing all provided in exchange for total loyalty. This wasn't mere employment, it was a family. You didn't clock out at 5 p.m., you stayed late, tweaking product designs, rehearsing sales pitches, or fixing product snags because you knew the company had your back forever. Junior engineers logged nights on the factory floor to perfect the cassette head. Sales reps skipped weekends to close export deals. No one called it overtime. They called it duty. The West watched in awe and adopted Japan Inc., the idea that an entire nation could operate like a single massive corporation. MITI set export targets. CEOs mapped the global strategies, and salarymen executed them with relentless precision. And the results are staggering. From 1955 to 1975, Japan's GDP surged at an average of 10% per year. By 1980, the country's nominal GDP had rocketed from $91 billion to over $1 trillion, transforming wartime rubble into the world's second largest economy. So it felt like everything was clicking perfectly. But if this golden trinity of state, business, and worker worked so well, why did it stop working? Did the very system that built Sony somehow begin holding it back? Well, let's take a look. By the late 1980s, Japan wasn't just a success story, it was the story. By 1989, Japan represented 45% of global stock market capitalization, and Japanese banks were the biggest in the world. Everything seemed to be going smoothly for major Japanese corporations. But all good things must come to an end. And it started with the craziest real estate bubble in human history, which ironically had little to do with how well these companies were actually performing. It was the broader economic madness that would trigger the downfall of Japan's global champions. Okay, so what happened? When everyone had secure jobs at big companies and owned homes, what did they do with their extra money? You probably want to invest that money to make more money, right? So they poured it into real estate speculation. They were buying investment properties not to live in, but to flip them for more money later. Companies also started buying land not for factories or offices, but simply to use as collateral for loans to buy more land. It became a self-reinforcing cycle of madness. The problem was that Japanese banks, flush with cash from export boom, were lending massive amounts to anyone who owned property. Regular office workers could borrow up to 100 million yen using their homes as collateral, sometimes without even proving they had steady income to pay it back. 100 million yen was equivalent to about 750,000 US dollars back then, which in today's purchasing power would be worth almost $2 million. So yeah, banks were essentially lending $2 million to regular office workers. And when that keeps up, you can guess what happens next. Land prices increased 5,000% in just 30 years. To put this in perspective, if your house cost $100,000 in 1956, then by 1986, it would be valued at $5 million. And people at the time were under the delusion that land prices would rise forever, simply because they had risen for 30 straight years. At the bubble's peak, Tokyo real estate was 350 times more expensive than equivalent space in Manhattan. And the Imperial Palace, that's where Emperor Hirohito lived, its grounds alone were calculated to be worth more than the entire state of California, valued between $850 billion to $5.1 trillion. That was just for about 1.2 square kilometers or 12.4 million square feet. So the Bank of Japan looked at this speculation madness and panicked. They realized that when a single Tokyo parking space was worth more than New York Central Park and the Imperial Palace grounds were valued higher than all of California, something had to give. So they made what many consider a catastrophic policy mistake. Instead of gradually cooling the market, they decided to kill it. They aggressively raised interest rates 5 times in rapid succession, from 3.25% in May 1989 to 6% by December 1990. A massive 2.75 percentage point spike in less than 2 years. It was like slamming the brakes on a speed train going 200 miles per hour. At the same time, the Ministry of Finance introduced the landing caps specifically targeting real estate in April 1990, choking off the credit that had fueled the property boom. They also slapped on new taxes, a 3-point consumption tax and higher land transfer taxes, all at once. The result? The bubble didn't deflate gradually. It exploded. And because everything was so interconnected and leveraged, what should have been a controlled correction became an economic catastrophe that Japan still hasn't fully recovered from. Here is what made it so devastating. You see, leverage amplified everything. When stock prices started falling in January 1990, it triggered margin calls. When banks couldn't lend to real estate anymore in March 1990, property values started collapsing. Since much of the stock market gains were financed by using inflated real estate as collateral, falling property prices forced more stock sales, which drove prices down further. By 1991, business bankruptcies had surged 68.5% to over 10,700 companies, the highest since World War II. Major financial institutions started collapsing as well. Yamaichi Securities, Japan's third largest brokerage and century-old institution, went bankrupt in 1997. Sony, despite being one of Japan's strongest companies, was not immune. In 1999, Sony announced it would cut 17,000 jobs, 10% of its workforce, and close 15 factories worldwide as profits plummeted by 1/3. The company's electronics division, which had dominated global markets, saw sales collapse as the strong yen made Japanese products uncompetitive internationally. Remember the salaryman culture I mentioned earlier? The dedicated employees who gave companies their all because in return, the company would take care of them for life? So what happens when they suddenly get laid off? The psychological impact was devastating. An entire generation realized that lifetime employment was a broken promise. The social contract that had powered Japan's miracle was shattered. Worse yet, instead of letting failed companies die, the government and banks kept them on life support. Banks terrified of recognizing massive losses, continued lending to bankrupt companies in what economists call zombie lending. These zombie companies couldn't grow or innovate. They could barely survive. From 1991 to 2001, Japan's economy barely grew at just 1.14% annually, what came to be known as the lost decade. You would think that after hitting rock bottom, Japanese companies would reinvent themselves, take risks, and fight back. Instead, they did the opposite. And that's where our story gets really interesting. The lifetime employment system I mentioned earlier that once powered Japan's miracle now became a prison. Companies couldn't fire underperforming workers because of social obligations, so they couldn't hire fresh talent either. Young people were blocked from leadership roles by layers of senior managers who had nowhere else to go. Decision-making slowed down to a crawl. Everything needed consensus from executives who had never worked outside Japan. Basically, instead of embracing change, Japanese companies doubled down on caution. Risk-taking became seen as reckless. Corporate boards filled with risk-averse bureaucrats who had climbed the ladder through seniority, not innovation. The bold global vision of leaders like Akio Morita was replaced by committee-based consensus and incremental thinking. While Sony was perfecting Blu-ray players, Netflix was building streaming platforms. While Nintendo was designing better cartridges, mobile games were taking over. While Japanese automakers were optimizing engines, Tesla was reimagining cars as computers on wheels. To make matters worse, as the world went online, Japanese tech companies made a fatal mistake. They kept building amazing products, but only for Japan. Galapagos syndrome is a Japanese business term coined around 2004 that describes when products or technologies develop in isolation within a local market and become so specialized for that market that they cannot succeed globally. The term references Charles Darwin's observations on the Galapagos Islands, where species evolved in isolation and became perfectly adapted to the local environment but couldn't survive elsewhere. Think about it. Japan actually had the world's most advanced mobile phones in 2005, with internet access, email, mobile payments, and even TV streaming. Until I looked it up, I didn't even know that Japan had already invented mobile payments and QR codes in the early 2000s, pretty much years before the iPhone even existed. But these were proprietary Japan-only systems using custom standards. World-class innovations got buried in technical documentation that never left Japan. Japanese companies remained obsessed with launching perfect hardware, which may have worked in the 1980s when product cycles were measured in years. But in the 2000s, when software could be updated weekly and user preferences shifted monthly, perfectionism became paralysis. The results were devastating across Japan's former champions. Sony's market cap fell 80% between 2000 and 2012. They missed flat-screen TVs, losing out to Samsung, the smartphone revolution despite making excellent components, and streaming music, losing out to iTunes and Spotify. To give credit where credit is due, Sony initially struggled during the digital camera transition as well, when Canon and Nikon's DSLRs dominated the market. But they did eventually find major success in mirrorless cameras, becoming a market leader by the 2010s, and essentially pioneering a full-frame mirrorless revolution. Sharp, once a pioneer in LCD TV technology, and the company that created the world's first commercial camera phone in 2000, suffered a dramatic decline in the global TV market. Sharp simply couldn't compete with fast-moving Korean rivals like Samsung and LG, who offered competitive quality at lower prices. The company was eventually acquired by Taiwan's Foxconn. Yes, the same company that manufactures iPhone components, in 2016 for $3.5 billion, a fraction of its former value. Toshiba's collapse was even more spectacular, involving a massive accounting scandal from which the company systematically inflated profits by $1.2 billion over 7 years. It was corporate culture gone wrong, where 3 consecutive CEOs pressured subordinates to meet unrealistic profit targets while maintaining a culture that discouraged employees from challenging senior executives. Toshiba's acquisition of Westinghouse Electric turned into a catastrophic bet when Westinghouse filed for bankruptcy in March 2017 after massive cost overruns on the US nuclear plant projects. This forced Toshiba to book a net loss of 1 trillion yen, around $7 billion for 2017. One of the largest annual losses in Japanese corporate history. Look, the point is, by 2010, Japan's global corporate champions were shadows of their former selves, still making excellent products, but stifling innovation through corporate politics and becoming increasingly irrelevant to a world that has moved on without them. Okay, so this all sounds a bit depressing, but could Japan still make a comeback? In November 2022, the Japanese government launched its most ambitious economic bet in decades, the Startup Development 5-Year Plan. The goal? Create 100 unicorn companies. 100,000 startups, and attract 10 trillion yen, about 67 billion US dollars in investment by 2027, is Japan's moonshot to reclaim its innovative edge. They've expanded startup visas nationwide, allowing foreign entrepreneurs to stay for up to 2 years without immediately setting up offices or security capital. Now, unicorns are companies valued at over $1 billion, so that's pretty hard for any company to achieve. The chances of a startup reaching unicorn status are extremely low, less than 0.1% of all startups ever reach billion-dollar valuations. Early signs show mixed progress. Japan now has over 10,000 startups and venture capital investment reaching approximately $5 billion in 2024. However, Japan currently has only about 7 to 8 unicorn companies, including Sakana AI and Preferred Networks. This represents relatively flat growth compared to the previous year, and Japan still lags significantly behind the plan's ambitious target of creating 100 unicorns by 2027. But here's the bigger problem. Japan still faces a fundamental challenge that goes beyond government funding. The government's policies are creating more startups. That's great. But are they creating the right kind of startups? Many Japanese entrepreneurs are still building for the domestic market first, planning global expansion later. Ultimately, the founder's vision really matters. If they're homegrown talent who don't speak English well and have limited global perspective, can they really go global and build world-class products? Here's Japan's catch-22. Japan's domestic market is large enough that startups don't need to go global to survive. With 125 million people and a $4 trillion economy, Japan startups can build substantial businesses serving only local customers. This is fundamentally different from South Korea, which has only 51 million people, and even that's shrinking fast. Korean companies like Samsung, LG, and Hyundai had no choice but to go global in order to remain competitive. So the risk is that Japan's startup boom becomes another version of the Galapagos syndrome, innovative companies that thrive locally but cannot compete internationally. But there is a bigger structural issue that no one is really talking about. What is the ultimate goal of a startup and its investors? They have to keep growing and exit at some point, right? Well, how do you exit to make money? Either you can sell your company via M&A or mergers and acquisitions, or you take your company public through an IPO. Here's what's fascinating. It's surprisingly easy for companies to go public in Japan. They don't have to be unicorns with billions of dollars in valuations. I interviewed a foreign founder and investor in Japan who built a super successful company there, and this is what he had to say.
I do think actually one of the problems in the ecosystem is that in Japan it's relatively easy to go public. You have like 100 companies a year go public in Japan, but the average market cap is around $100 million. So like, Series A or Series B in the States. What it means is that the ecosystem has gotten very familiar with how to go public. And so even if the ecosystem says, yes, we want to have more unicorns, we want to have decacorns, most of the people in the ecosystem haven't done that before. But most people in the ecosystem have maybe seen or know some companies that have gone public.
So in a way, going public is actually less of a risk.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
And there's a path to do it. So liquidity is great. The problem is that a lot of parts of the ecosystem reinforce that path to going public as soon as possible. And as a result of the goals of the company, the goal becomes to go public. And when that becomes the case, then so what I see so often is, companies like $1 million of revenue, they start to prepare to go public and they go public when they have like $10 million of revenue. And even if the founder thinks like, okay, finally now I'm free of my restrictions to kind of focus on going public and I can now grow the company, the organizational muscles they've built to go public are so different than the organizational muscles that you need to continue to leverage on and kind of take on more risk and go after, triple digit growth.
This reveals the core problem. 70% of venture capital exits in Japan happens through IPOs, compared to just 10% through M&As, the complete opposite of Silicon Valley. About 60% of Japanese startups that go public remain micro-cap companies with market capitalizations under 10 billion yen, roughly about $70 million. Japanese VCs and investors are incentivized to push startup founders towards IPOs because that gives them the quickest path to their return on investment. So unless you get visionary founders like Morita who built Sony, the kind of leaders that are willing to go against their investors and stay laser focused on taking their companies truly global, the result is that startups begin prioritizing quick IPO exits over long-term global scaling the moment they get funded. So the 5-year plan expires in 2027. By then, we'll know whether Japan can break free from its cultural and structural barriers to create true global companies once again, or whether even the most ambitious government intervention cannot overcome decades of risk-averse corporate culture. The ingredients are there: government funding and a new generation of Japanese entrepreneurs. But will it be enough to compete with Silicon Valley's risk-taking culture and China's scale? Japan's economic future may depend on the answer. If you found this video insightful and you learned something new, hit subscribe so we know there's an audience out there who wants more of these deep dive explainers. Our mission has always been to inform our global audience about what's really happening in Asia, the stories you don't usually get from the mainstream media. So give us your feedback, tell us what you'd like us to cover next, and we will do our best to make it happen. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay curious.